Hello, this is Perry Marshall. I'm here with Ed Kelly, and he is a scientist at the University of Virginia. And I got a hold of his book, Irreducible Mind Towards a Psychology for the 21st Century. Now, this book is probably about 17 years old. It's also about 700 pages, and I don't think one necessarily has to read an entire 700-page book to figure out that it's got a lot of substance. And what Ed does in this book is he attacks the question from about 12 different angles. And the question is a mind and a brain just the same thing? Is just a physical process, and that's the end of the story? Or is it possible that a mind and a brain are actually two different things and can function independently, which would lend credence to the idea that there could be an afterlife, that people can have out-of-body experiences, that psychic phenomena that have been discussed for centuries could actually have some basis in physical reality. And I was impressed with the amount of evidence that he brought forth and how deep back into the literature that he goes in this book. And so I've been wanting to get him on for over a year, and I managed to get him now. And we were talking just before the podcast began, and I said, well, in the book, since it's an academic book, I don't really feel like I get your story. And podcasts are for getting people's stories. And so that's what we're going to do today. So, Ed, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. We're clearly simpatico on some things.
Yes.
And why don't you give me, go back to, like, when did you start becoming curious about these things? And there must have been a moment or two where some big realizations dropped on you. Tell me about that. Where does this story begin?
Oh gosh. Well, it began in graduate school. Um, I was doing a dissertation on use of computers to reduce ambiguity in typical behavioral science text.
Hmm.
And we had, well, we basically created a concordance for a huge sample by those standards of that time. It was 500,000 words. It'd be kid stuff now, of course, but at that time, the printout of the concordance filled a sizable office in William James Hall at Harvard. And what we tried to do was for about 2,000 of the highest frequency words in English, we were going to try to develop rules based on what we saw in this concordance that would enable us to distinguish the most important senses of these words. And that would have led to quite an improvement in computer-aided content analysis. Anyway, the project went on for a number of years and was moderately successful, I would say, in terms of the practical task. But for me, it was terrifically destructive because I quickly became convinced that the basic approach was fundamentally flawed and would never succeed.
Hmm.
That is, what the kind of theory that was going around at the time said that, well, what we're doing in disambiguating words in context is just picking which of the several or many pre-established senses are there and just finding out which one it is in the current context. It became clear to me that that is not what goes on. If you look at dictionaries, look up any really common word like run or go or through or something like that. And if you look at a bunch of dictionaries, you'll notice right away that they list a number of senses that's proportional basically to the size of the dictionary. That is, they give you as many examples as they can handle. But what's really happening is that these words have many fewer, much more general senses. And we, as fluent speakers, understand those meanings and we're able
Yes.
to generalize them into novel but semantically appropriate circumstances, including, in particular, circumstances where the usage is metaphorical. That is, according to the rules, it doesn't even belong in that context. And yet you understand something new in terms of something old. And I thought this showed clearly that the kind of approaches that were being developed on the computers of the day were doomed to failure. And by the way, I think, and this gentleman, Federico Fagin, who's a major guy in the computer world, also thinks that this is the fatal flaw at the heart of artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
these things don't understand a damn thing. They have no consciousness, which is that with which we grasp meanings, understand things. Its treatment in science generally, including psychology and neuroscience, is a disaster at present, I think. He thinks. Many of us think. I think you think as well. It's like evolution. It's these elephants in the room staring people in the face that conflict with the sort of prevailing story, science-based story of the world, which I think we're both arguing in our different ways is not only incomplete, but just fundamentally wrong and has to be expanded in some way that allows us to understand a whole bunch of things about life and human nature and consciousness and minds and so on, that the prevailing picture just can't cope with.
So I believe what you're saying is this project presumed that all words could be mechanically defined in
Yeah.
terms of other words. And if we just had a big enough map of words connecting to words connecting to words, that a computer would master the English language. And you figured out apple is not red fruit. Apple is a human experience that we attach a word to. And when I use the word apple and you use the word apple, we are both referring to an experience which computer does not have. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's you have a gift for putting things in a readily graspable way. So thank you. Yeah.
So I totally agree. And seems like about half the AI people in the world still have not figured this out.
Yeah. Do you
Maybe
follow?
the other half have, depending. But this popped open a rabbit hole for you. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't just the computer project.
Hmm.
It's a larger existential question, it sounds like.
Well, I was at the end of my dissertation. The need for employment loomed. And suddenly I was confronted with the realization that what I thought was going to be my sort of hobby horse going forward was profoundly flawed. And I was deeply distressed by that and really kind of floundering when the second event occurred. I got a call from my mother one afternoon, a weekday afternoon, while I was at work. This is not a normal occurrence. And she was calling to inform me that my older sister, my only sibling, who's about 7 years older than I am, had become a medium, a person who purports to deliver messages from the other side and that sort of thing. And clearly, my mother was rather concerned about this. And she clearly figured that since I was a graduate student in psychology, I'd know all about it and could reassure her. Well, I didn't have any idea what she was talking about at the time. So I proceeded to Widener Library, where I soon realized there was, shelves full of books, people doing experiments on things that seemed to be forbidden by the prevailing view of things, using the same kind of methods that I was being taught. So I found that really interesting, not threatening. I mean, if these experiments were correct, and the ones that I looked at early on seemed to be well done, like you, it didn't take me long to develop a sense, hey, this must be for real. I wasn't absolutely convinced, but enough to begin corresponding with J.B. Ryan, who was then on at the time in Durham, North Carolina. J.B. Ryan, Joseph Banks Ryan, was the guy who developed a parapsychology lab at Duke University back in the 1930s. This was when William McDougall, a British philosopher and psychologist, interested in psychical research, had assumed the chair of the newly formed Department of Psychology at Duke, and he brought in J.B. Ryan, who was a tough ex-Marine and sort of the right guy in the right place at the right time who developed this, simple but effective line of experimentation using specially designed cards, the five famous ESP cards, with the wavy lines and stars and all that, and dice throwing as a way of testing for psychokinesis, mind over matter. And they, very systematically improved their procedures, both experimental procedures and statistical procedures, and continued to get positive results showing that these things really did happen. So I corresponded with Ryan for a while, and basically right out of graduate school, I took a job at his place. The
Wow.
Yeah, it was very risky. I mean, in retrospect, wow, I was
Mhm.
lucky I survived this professionally.
Yes.
Anyway, so I began working for him, and I hadn't been there more than about a month when a guy showed up. It turned out he was a student at Yale Law School. That's where I had gone to college as an undergraduate. And there was a guy that I had worked with, actually, a psychologist named Irv Child. And this young man in the law school turned out had a long history of experiences, had developed the capacity to do a lot of stuff voluntarily, had presented himself to the dean of the law school saying he found torts and stuff like that terribly uninteresting in light of these other things that he could do. He then did some for that person who referred him to a person in psychiatry who knew the guy that I had worked for. And Irv Child, it turned out, by this time, this is now 1972, had become interested in parapsychology himself. And he knew that I had started working with Ryan. So he sent this person down to the lab in Durham. So he came in the very first day. All of us who were working there sitting around a big table. JB and his wife Louisa, Louie, as she was known to her acquaintances, the brains of the organization, if I can slip that in. Um, and at the time, the research director was a man named Helmut Schmidt, who had been he was a physicist who had worked at Boeing for many years, had become interested in parapsychology and developed a special electronic testing machine. It was a four-choice machine. There were four colored lights, four correspondingly colored buttons. Subject's task is to pick the button corresponding to the light that will be chosen by the computer. And the process was unusually sophisticated. There's a four choice switch going around at 5 megahertz or something like that. And the final position was selected by the arrival of a particle from a radioactive stuff inside the device. Helmut told me
Yep.
later, by the way, that it would be prohibited now that it was big enough to be a little bit dangerous.
Wow.
Anyway, Helmut, while he was still working at Boeing, had spent years looking for people who could succeed at this task. And he had found a couple who could do like 26, 27%, as opposed to the expected 25% over
Yep.
thousands of trials, and thereby become significant. Anyway, so this chap, Bill Delmore was his name. He's recently died, unfortunately. He came in and proceeded to start telling us his story. And every so often, he'd reach over and push a button. And it wasn't long before we all began to realize, hey, he was doing better at this than we had seen ever before.
Hmm.
And as it turned out, in the course of that hour, he got 180 hits in 508 trials, which is a bit over 35%.
Mm.
And all by itself. And to do that well or better by chance would happen once in 10 million times or something. So we could have sat
Yes.
there for 10 million hours before something like that had occurred by chance. And that
Yep.
was just the beginning with this guy. He went on from there. So, I mean, he essentially, and I had him living in my house for 6 weeks during that first visit, which was one of the most disorienting but exhilarating experiences of my entire life. I mean, stuff constantly happened around this guy that was just bizarre. Here I was, a freshly minted PhD. I thought I knew pretty well what was possible and blah blah. Well, he disabused me of all that confidence in short order. Well, I'll give you one example. I mean, this kind of stuff never appears in articles in journals, but this is the kind of stuff that went on around him. He liked Cheerios, and he would eat an enormous amount of this stuff. So one morning, he poured out a huge bowl of Cheerios, and I said, Bill, how many Cheerios are in that bowl? And he said, I don't remember the number, 468 or something like that. Well, I dumped them out and counted the damn things, and he was exactly right. I mean, give me a break. You can't even see most of them. How did you do that? Anyway, at the end of that 6 weeks, I took him up to Harvard and sat him down on the 15th floor of William James Hall in front of a bunch of my former, teachers there. And the reason was that there was a fund there that had been accumulating since the time of William James. Hardly anybody had ever used any of it. The Hodgson Fund, after an Australian lawyer who was the principal investigator, by the way, of Mrs. Piper, a medium that made a big impression on William James. Anyway, so the hope was to get some cash out of this fund and get Bill Delmore back for a longer period of work. And we actually succeeded in that. We got a modest grant. It was enough to let him take a leave of absence from law school. He came back and we did a whole bunch of experiments, published a bunch of studies. So at this point, of course, I'm sold on the reality of the basic phenomena. And let me just say categorically that something like 150 years of serious scientific work, including case and field studies and a couple of thousand experimental studies, have produced evidence that should be enough to convince any reasonable person who takes the trouble to study it that these things exist as facts of nature, and our science is going to have to expand somehow in order to accommodate them. Period.
I agree. I've seen that literature. It's there.
It's there.
And something you have to say about that literature is it only has to be right once, or like only one of those studies has to be true in order for the entire reductionist paradigm of science to be wrong.
Yeah.
Like they don't all need to be valid studies. It only takes a thimble of these to be right. And it overturns an entire Newtonian assumption of the world that's been with us for hundreds of years.
Absolutely. In fact, William James made exactly that point early on. He said, in order to prove that all crows are not black, all you need is one white crow. And my white crow is Mrs. Piper. And contrary to widely spread falsehoods, James never abandoned that view of Mrs. Piper. He continued, he was interested from the beginning of his career right to the end in these phenomena, and fought the kind of stuff that you and I have fought with our respective vigilantes of the establishment.
Yes. Well, so continue. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
So
okay. So I went on. I worked for Ryan for about a year and a half, but became interested in the possibility of studying psi. That's the generic sort of neutral term for the whole set of phenomena, both input stuff, ESP, clairvoyance, precognition, telepathy, all that, and PK or psychokinesis, mind over matter. And the hope was that, well, there was a particular reason why I started in this direction. And again, it had to do with this guy, Bill Delmore. We did some experiments which we were able to show conclusively that one of the things underlying his unusual success, and by the way, he was guessing playing cards at 3 times chance expectation for thousands of trials. I mean, that's the kind of levels of success that he had. It was clear that the main carrier of the information was visual imagery. That is, we did a separate study in which he was looking at slides of the cards, but projected briefly, so he couldn't see them very well. And it turned out he made virtually identical systematic errors in the visual task as in the clairvoyance task, if you will, where he was strictly deprived of visual access to the cards. And that confirmed what he told us he was doing. I mean, we asked him, of course, interviewed him to find out how he thought he did it. And he'd close his eyes and he'd sit there for a while, waiting for imagery to appear. And it could appear anywhere. It could be big or small, move quickly or slowly, could be colored or not, vivid, clear or not. And so he would make systematic Urs like the Urs he made. So face cards, for example, would be mixed up, and cards that were otherwise identical except for colors, things of that sort. So it seemed to me, wow, what if we had a bunch of electrodes on his head as he was doing this? Maybe we could find clues in the physiology preceding the response that would
Hmm.
predict whether it was a good response or a bad one. That would be a huge step forward. And so I started down this path. It turned out there were some people over in the electrical engineering department at Duke who were very interested in that line of work. They were working on biofeedback, EEG biofeedback, trying to, as an aid to meditation practice and things of that sort. And I had never been able to convince JB that this was a worthwhile thing to do. So I just migrated over there as a kind of postdoctoral associate. And we continued there for about 10 years, uh, made slow but steady progress, I think, in that direction, built a nice, very small but nice facility using one of Federico's early microprocessors, by the way, the 8080 as the data collection agent down in our
Wow.
lab. And then there was a PDP-11 up in the main part of the electrical engineering department upstairs. We were connected to it by and at the time, during most of that period, we were very encouraged by the progress we've been able to make, despite, I mean, horrific financial troubles. I ran that program basically from 1973 to about 1979 on an average of about $20,000 a year.
Wow.
That was to cover my full-time salary, part-time stipends for a couple of other people, and any equipment needs that we had. But we survived it and we crept slowly forward in a very systematic, careful way. Then the dean of the School of Engineering died. He was a Yugoslavian guy, a civil engineer, who was very interested in our work, very supportive of it. But he actually was the first casualty of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in the Triangle area in 1980. And then started a search for a new guy. And it turned out, I don't know, you probably encountered the Pear Lab at Princeton Engineering
I
Anomalies.
I interviewed Brenda Dunn about 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh,
Yes, I
wow. Oh, good.
yes.
Yeah.
I interviewed Dean Radin a couple years ago also.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well,
That's a great interview. So yeah,
oh, good. Anyway, it turned out the guy that they got was a man named Earl Dowell, who had been Bob John's assistant dean at
I need to pause and explain the Paralab for a second. You want to kind of, because not everybody's going to know what we're talking about. Can you
Okay,
just
sure.
briefly explain those people?
Yeah. You're probably better acquainted with them than I am. I didn't have much to do with them, to tell you the truth, professionally. I mean, I knew about them, of course, and read some of the papers, but I had a spat with Bob John early on about his method, his statistical method for scoring remote viewing data.
Well, so the Paralab stood for Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab.
Yeah.
Howard Hughes funded it in the 1970s. Princeton's bylaws said that if an alumnus wants to fund a work or a department, they're allowed to do it. And so, even though it was very politically incorrect to put together a lab that's studying psychic phenomenon and telekinesis and all of that, um, Princeton had no choice but to let them do it. And that lab ran for something like 27 years.
Mhm.
And they ran all kinds of experiments to they showed that by concentrating, some people could deflect falling balls by a measurable amount. Some people could telepathically send messages to other people. And there's a book called Margins of Reality, which for the most part is so boring that you couldn't have possibly made it up because it's just an academic research
Hmm.
book about all of this research they did. But it shows with 5 nines of statistical confidence that these things actually did happen. And it describes in excruciating detail the meticulous experiments they did to make sure that they were measuring the right thing. And then there's a fascinating chapter at the end where he says, and so now that we've discovered all these things, we've proved these things to 99.999% confidence. Let me also point out that the average rank and file scientist doesn't want to have anything to do with this kind of stuff. But the very best creme de la creme, the Einsteins and the Niels Bohrs and like all those guys, they're always interested in this kind of stuff. And they always ask interesting questions like this. And so the question is, when is the mainstream going to finally roll over and realize that and so I'll just add my own 2 cents to this.
Hmm.
I have a $10 million prize for the origin of the genetic code, and we get a submission probably every week. And to be perfectly blunt with you, most of the submissions are lame,
Hmm.
not worth trifling with. A few of them are interesting. And I've had some very interesting conversations with some of the best people in the origin of life field. Nobody's even come close to figuring out where did the genetic code come from? And I think so. I have a blog post called "Ways to Win the Evolution 2.0 Prize," and maybe 25% of there's an interview that I do, and maybe 25% of that discussion is, I think one of the rocks that we have to look under is psi research,
Hmm.
because psi research tells us that the universe works fundamentally different than the standard narrative that you read in any physics book. And like, I don't know how to solve origin of the genetic code, but where do you start?
Hmm.
You start with the stuff that everybody is pretending is not there. That's how you solve any intractable problem. Well, what's the work that's already been done that nobody wants to talk about? Or what's the question that nobody seems to have the answer to? Or what's the answer that nobody seems to want to accept? So I can't claim to have any kind of a complete picture of this, but I did write a paper called The Role of Quantum Mechanics in Cognition-Based Evolution,
Oh.
where I say that consciousness controls codes which control chemistry, not the other way around. And we have all kinds of evidence
Hmm.
that this is how cause and effect works in biology. We have no evidence that codes can make that chemicals make codes. We have no evidence that codes make consciousness. We have no evidence that computers are going to be conscious, not the way we understand them today. And so we have to start with the little bits of clues that come from people like the Princeton lab.
Hmm.
So that's kind of a backstory. So why don't you continue? You've had a lot of interactions with the researchers in this field.
Hmm. All right. So Earl Dow, who had been Bob John's assistant dean at Princeton, arrived, and almost immediately I got a request to send him my CV, which I did. And a couple of days later, he called me into his office. So I sat down. He handed me my CV, and I just kind of glanced through it and saw that there were huge red check marks next to the, 3 publications in biomedical engineering. And his first words to me were, "You started out so well." You can imagine where that.
Yeah. And he
Anyway,
read you the riot act for going into the wrong field.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that was it. It was basically immediately clear that there wasn't going to be any of this woo-woo going on in his school of engineering.
Yeah.
So anyway, we lingered on for a couple more years. We actually created a nonprofit research institute and funded it by trying to commercially develop some of the technical things that we had done while we were in the department. But we were getting further from our real interests, and we eventually ran out of money altogether. And at that point, I discovered how much damage I had done to my job worthiness as a psychologist. I applied to some places in the neighborhood that wouldn't even have been on my shopping list, coming out of graduate school, and was told stuff like, Dear Mr. Kelly, deliberately, there is no room in this department of scientific psychology for someone with your interests. I mean, wow, this was quite a revelation. I realized, I really had taken quite a risk. Anyway, I had the great good fortune to land on my feet with a guy at UNC Chapel Hill in a big physiology group studying somatosensory neuroscience. That is the part of your brain that deals with touch, temperature, pain, stuff like that. And I worked for him. I spent about the next 13 years of my career doing mainly neuroimaging studies, EEG and fMRI studies of responses to tactile stimuli, specifically vibrations applied to fingers. And learned a lot of neuroscience in the process. This guy, Barry Witzel was his name, the leader of that group, was a wonderful guy and a really smart, well-trained neuroscientist. We had lunch virtually every day, and I just learned enormous amounts from him. And he was interested in parapsychology. We talked about that quite a bit. I think he's like a lot of scientists who are privately interested, but not willing to kind of come out of the closet on the subject.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, then the next key part here is that I mean, I continued to be interested in psychical research, but couldn't put much time into it. But I was on the board of the American Society for Psychical Research. And in the early 90s, in that capacity, I met my current wife, Emily, who had been working for Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. She was his most valued colleague, who was willing to subject him as well as other people to very careful editorial scrutiny and make him work for her approval. I had a catastrophic first marriage, a woman that I met at the Rhine Lab, and immediately cloaked her in the mantle of previous females in psychical research, like the wife of Henry Sidgwick, one of the founders of the British Society for Psychical Research, and JB's own wife, Louis. But it didn't work out, and I was in quite a terrible state until I landed on my feet with this group at UNC, and later on in that period connected with Emily, and we've been together ever since. We presided, by the way, well, didn't preside, we attempted to prevent the takeover of the American Society for Psychical Research by a group sort of welling up from inside that we warned, and which has, in fact, ruined the place, basically. They've consumed all of its assets. It's reduced to rubble. Terrible thing. William James is one of the founders in 1885 or something like that. But because we had gotten together, I was increasing my level of activity in psychical research. And in 1998, Emily and I and a couple of other people from DOPS, Bruce Grayson, who works on near-death experiences, and Jim Tucker, who is Ian Stevenson's successor, the main person working on, who until recently anyhow, has been working on these cases of the reincarnation type court. That's another one of our jargon terms. These are small children typically who begin to remember and speak about past lives in a way that you can potentially verify things that they say or the kinds of behaviors that they show, that sort of thing. Now, Mike Murphy, you may know, is the co-founder of Esalen Institute out in Big Sur, California. It is to humanistic and transpersonal psychology more or less what Mecca is to Islam. In fact, many of the major pioneers of those subjects spent time at Esalen, sometimes lived there for years at a time. Mike Murphy is a kind of Renaissance man, very much in the straight line of descent from the founders of the British SPR in 1882, shares their interests and attitudes, especially that these kinds of phenomena are not beyond the reach of science. We just have to do the science to study them. So let's get on with it.
Yes.
Anyway, he was well aware that if the kind of physicalism that prevails, it's the received wisdom of opinion elites everywhere. In academia, virtually all of the central parts of academia are immersed in this physicalist worldview,
Yes.
which is not science. It's a philosophical doctrine based in late 19th century classical physics, period.
Agree.
And that's what
Agree.
most psychologists and neuroscience in particular, my people, believe is the correct scientific picture of things, even though physicists know that it's been overturned at a very fundamental level with the advent of relativity and quantum theory and all that. But that
Yes.
stuff is all sort of too far away from everyday life, too big, too slow, too small, too fast, all that sort of stuff. So we can safely ignore it. Anyway, Mike understood that if physicalism is true, there cannot be any such thing as postmortem survival, period. And that's a logical fact. And yet, there have been people all around the planet producing research that seems to suggest that maybe some of us do, at least sometimes, survive for some period of time under largely unknown conditions. But hey, even that little bit, if correct, is a very important fact.
It only takes one.
It only takes one. So he, in his typical way, Mike, and he's not so much involved in the everyday life of Esalen, but he's created this thing called the Center for Theory and Research, which is basically his private think tank. And he convenes groups, fellowships, as he calls them, under the auspices of CTR to pursue various subjects of interest to him. So he was forming one on the issue of postmortem survival. And he invited several of us to come. There were about 20 of us in the first meeting in 1998. And so we began to, present and review, argue about the various kinds of evidence that exist for survival. And let me just say parenthetically that there's a lot more of this than most people, most scientists certainly have any idea. And it's of several different types, including some only recently discovered types, including these cases of the reincarnation type. And I'll get to another particularly important one in a little bit. Anyway, the way these things work is there's an annual meeting, a week-long meeting basically at Esalen in this fantastic place perched on a cliff over the Pacific Ocean. If Mike Murphy had done nothing else but create Esalen, he'd have had a very productive life, but for him, that's just the beginning. Amazing character. After two of these meetings, we had not arrived at any real consensus about survival. There was a spectrum of opinion about that. And that's true, by the way, in the field in general. You can find people on both sides of that dividing line who are roughly equally informed and able. It's a very tough thing, mainly because of the existence of psi, the other forms of psi. Because let's say a medium is giving, what sounds like straight talk from deceased Uncle Joe. How do you rule out the possibility that the medium is doing it herself by exercising her own psi powers? Maybe she's getting it from the sitter, who is Joe's grandson or whatever, or from documents that exist about Joe's life, or
Yep.
so on. So you see the problem, and it's dogged the field for since the beginning, since the 1880s. Still not fully resolved, although I'll issue my current sense of the situation in a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but what we were agreed upon was that we all think that this prevailing physicalism has got to go. And by the way, Simon Conway Morris at Oxford, he's the guy on convergence and all that. He speaks of physicalism as having passed its sell-by date. He's very much in the same camp.
Yes. Agree. Yeah.
And so we hatched a plan. We would attack physicalism, and we would do it in two stages. First stage was to assemble in one place a lot of evidence, not all of it by any means, but a lot of evidence for human capacities that are, if not impossible, extremely difficult to explain in conventional physicalist terms. That gave rise to book number one that you showed earlier. There are two additional books, however. Let me say a little bit about Irreducible Mind. Um, in putting it together, we really followed the example of one of the founders of the SPR, a man named Frederick Myers, who published massive amounts of stuff between 1882 and 1901 when he died, and was in the process of finishing a book called Human Personality. And if only it had been published under that title, it would probably be much better known than it is today. But a subtitle was added after he died, and its survival of bodily death, which probably caused it to be immediately, anathematized by the gatekeepers in psychology. Myers had done basically what we were setting out to do. He studied a bunch of things, including psi phenomena, that to him seemed totally incompatible with the physicalist or materialist picture as it was known then. And he studied, what we elected to do was to revisit many of the same topics in light of a subsequent century of biomedical research in particular, and a number of related things that had developed since then. So Irreducible Mind starts by incorporating the entire literature of psychical research by reference. We gave just a annotated bibliography, giving people lots of pointers into that literature, into the key parts of it as we saw them. Because we didn't want this to be a book just about parapsychology. There are lots of those, but most mainstream scientists, in particular psychologists, would like to think that these psi phenomena are some kind of weird little anomaly. Okay, maybe we're having trouble explaining consciousness and all that, but hey, you can't explain this stuff. We can just kind of put it aside, quarantine it, and go on. We're successful across the board otherwise. Well, that is just not true. So Emily has a great chapter on psychophysical influence, starting with the little ones like how you raise your arm, general sort of placebo effects, moving on to ones that are more and more dramatic and specific, harder and harder. This is very Myers-like, to organize the presentation in a way that leads you into the territory where things get very difficult for the physicalist point of view. For example, stigmata, in which intensely religious persons who have a strong imaginative capacity, imagining the wounds they think occurred to Jesus, develop comparable wounds on their own bodies, sometimes in places that don't correspond to what actually happened, but to what they thought happened.
Yeah.
Hypnotic blisters, another case of Janet has a case of star-shaped pointer, cool, that he touches a patient, deeply hypnotized patient with, saying it's a red hot poker, a star-shaped blister appears. Now, we know how a hot poker produces a blister, but how a cool poker could do that, or how someone could do it with their imagination, something completely different.
Well, again, if this actually happens at all, then an entire libraries of assumptions just go out the window.
Yeah.
And I think it terrifies people.
Yes.
Then what?
You allude to it. I've already seen this in your book, that for some of these guys, what they believe about this physicalist philosophy, this worldview, it amounts to a secular faith. And they don't like heretics. And they'll go out of their way. They're like vigilantes and, the Inquisition to try and get rid of people, hurt them professionally, all that kind of stuff. It's really astonishing.
It's a pop religion.
Yeah, pop religion. Okay, then there's a big chapter on secondary personalities and centers of consciousness. That's by Adam Crabtree, who's an expert on the subject of what's now called dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality, used to be called. And the biggest point here is that there are well documented cases in which more than one personality appears to be associated with a single organism. Moreover, that the secondary personality is often much better, much more talented than the primary personality. Knows stuff that the primary personality has never had contact with. Maybe knows Latin, for example, one of a case studied by William James. And furthermore, there are sometimes these very peculiar relations of consciousness between the primary and secondary personality, such that the primary personality doesn't know anything about the secondary, but the secondary knows quite a bit about the primary, even knows what's going on in that person's mind, is there concurrently, not alternating with the primary personality. These pose huge challenges for the typical biological account of the mind with modules in the brain, in particular the use by separate entities, so to speak, of the same cognitive capacities embodied in particular parts of the brain. Now, there's a chapter on memory by Alan Gauld, who spent a large part of his life studying this subject. He's a great historian of psychical research, too. And his chapter is probably the hardest chapter in the book, and it overlaps quite a bit with the kinds of arguments that have appeared more recently among philosophers of mind. And yeah, one thing I should insert parenthetically here is that, we used to feel ourselves like trying to steer the Titanic from a rowboat, and that's still kind of the case. But now there are more rowboats kind of in the same territory with us, pulling in the same direction, one of which is younger philosophers of mind, who I think are increasingly unhappy with the physicalist story and trying to imagine a different way of looking at it. So I won't say more about that. Now comes a chapter I think is particularly important from the point of view of contemporary neuroscience and psychology. This is the one on OBEs, out of body experiences, and NDEs, near death experiences. Bruce Grayson has about 1,000 of these cases, and something over 200 of them are cases in which the experience occurred in conjunction with deep general anesthesia, as in a surgical procedure in a hospital, and or cardiac arrest. Now, cardiac arrest in particular abolishes conditions in the brain that virtually all neuroscientists believe are necessary for there to be conscious experience of any sort.
Mm.
And not only are these conscious experiences of some sort, but the biggest ones are essentially mystical experiences occurring under very suboptimal conditions where you almost have to die in order to have the damn thing. But people are transformed by these experiences, and they generally tend to become better people as a result. Now, Bruce Grayson is a psychiatrist who spends most of his time, or has spent, he's retired now, most of his time trying to make tiny changes, tiny constructive changes in people's lives, and takes weeks or months to accomplish that. And he marvels at the astonishing changes that occur in people in seconds or minutes in conjunction with these kinds of experiences. I think that this may be the sector of the spectrum of things that our people work on, psychical research, that may ultimately have the biggest impact on the ongoing theoretical debate, just because they come from the absolute heartland of contemporary biomedical science. We're getting better and better at rescuing people from the borderlands of death.
Yeah.
And they're coming back with these kinds of stories.
Yeah.
And they report things that can be verified. They report things that are going on in the surgical theater when they're out. They can sometimes report on things that happen down the hallway in a closed room where the doctor's talking to the family about how, sorry, but he's gone, that kind of stuff. And we're going to see more and more of them, I'm sure. There are also yes.
Well, go on, and then I'm going to turn the conversation a little different direction.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that there are two other chapters that are getting a little further out in terms of, well, one is on genius. Myers had a wonderful chapter on genius, but he also recognized that this was not an arena in which you can prove that it can't be explained in conventional terms. And then we had a big chapter on mystical experience as well. And let me say that I personally have become convinced over the course of this project that the state of the science of mystical experience should be a total embarrassment to contemporary science.
Mm.
Most people just ignore the subject entirely, and the very few that have paid attention to it have almost invariably, demeaned and pathologized it. And I've come to believe, along with a bunch of my colleagues in this book project, that it really is in some ways the key to the subject, that these things are really windows into normally inaccessible parts of reality, and that we damn well better get started studying them seriously. So there. Now, you want
So,
to insert your, because I'm about to change direction myself here.
so your mom calls you about your sister, you
Mhm.
down a rabbit hole. My sense is this was not just an intellectual curiosity. This was an existential thirst.
Yeah.
Am I, can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, the thing that got me interested in the first place is that it was clear that if the prevailing view of things is correct, that stuff shouldn't happen. That to me, that's what makes the damn things interesting. Makes
Yeah.
me, makes other people angry, but to me, wow, this is a chance to learn more about how things really are. Let's go for it.
Yes.
So that leads me right to this next thing. Now, there are two parts to this Myers-James stuff. First, and I think Irreducible Mind really accomplished two big things. I think we really did put together a strong empirical case against physicalism, complementing the kinds of stuff that's now being argued in philosophical circles and so on. There's a lot more interest in the last 10 years or 20 years in things like panpsychism and idealism and so on than would have been tolerated before that.
Yeah.
And that's a symptom of this sort of intellectual cultural malaise that we're in. Now, Myers and James had a picture of the human psyche that's radically different from what's standard today. Most psychologists and neuroscientists think that everyday consciousness is all the consciousness there is, that it's manufactured by neurophysiological stuff in our brains, supported by unconscious neural stuff going on, and that's it. When you die, lights out. No brain, no mind, no survival.
Yeah.
Myers and James both held that there's more consciousness, that the everyday consciousness is actually a kind of extract from a larger consciousness associated with each of us that can be accessed under circumstances
Mm.
largely unknown, but that we can certainly find out about. I mean, this is the stuff that we're good at scientifically,
Yeah.
studying conditions in the brain that permit the expression of these higher capacities. This is James's The More, where he explicitly thought reside things like psi phenomena, genius, and mystical experiences. That's where the stuff comes from. I think our book also went a long way toward strengthening that picture of the mind in contrast with the prevailing production model, as we call it. We also took a first crack at the problem of theory. It's one thing to, let's say, demonstrate that physicalism in its current form is not up to the job. But how is nature actually constituted in such a way that these things can happen?
Mhm.
That's a way harder
Yeah.
problem. The irreducible mind was a gigantic clerical task. Well, there are two succeeding books, Beyond Physicalism
Yes.
and Consciousness Unbound,
Mm.
where we mainly pursued that second task, trying to figure out, well, how is the world really constituted? Beyond Physicalism was the first big systematic attempt to do that. And to do it, we milled around for a couple of years and then hatched a plan, which is basically let's within the limitations of our current group or additional people we can recruit, uh, let's inventory past and present systems that take the phenomena for granted as real and try to propose a metaphysical kind of or conceptual framework or metaphysics capable of accommodating.
Mm,
So,
mm,
beyond physicalism consists mainly of there are three physicists, including Harold Ottmanspacher, by the way, cosmologist Bernard Carr, who comes at it from the relativity and string theory side, and Henry Stapp, who was a well-known quantum theorist. We also looked at some of the kind of ancient mystically informed religious philosophies from, for example, Neoplatonism and Vedanta in its various forms, Indian stuff, and Kashmir Shaivism, and several Western metaphysical pictures from Leibniz and Charles Sanders Peirce, and especially Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead, I think, a particularly interesting character, and his picture has a great deal in common with what Federico Fagin has independently invented out of his own experience of mystical states, plus his knowledge of computers and all of that. I mean, Whitehead was one of the towering intellects, certainly, of the 19th and 20th centuries, and he had the misfortune to develop his kind of speculative metaphysics at a time when the whole profession of philosophy was kind of going in the opposite direction, toward all this analytic stuff, get extreme clarity about little word meanings and things like that. Anyway, so they're all represented. And the basic story, which I tried to extract from it all in a next to last chapter, there's a kind of central tendency among all these. Nothing like absolute unanimity, but in general, we were tending toward what amounts to the opposite of physicalism, that is, toward some kind of idealism, but a realist idealism. I mean, it has to take seriously that we find ourselves in some place that we experience in mostly common ways, that we somehow have to incorporate or honor the discoveries of 3 centuries of science, including really modern science. So that's what we've been working on since then. The third book, Consciousness Unbound, really carries forward both threads. There are several new theories, including Federico's, by the way. He's got a good chapter in Consciousness Unbound. That's how I first got to know him.
mm,
And several others of similar type. There's one chapter, by the way, on Jung. This is by a Jung scholar named Roderick Mayne, and he shows that Jung was actually moving much closer to our sort of central tendency late in his own life when he had mystical experiences following in conjunction with a heart attack. And he
mm.
shows that quite clearly, and so that we see that as reeling Jung back into the our central tendency. So that's what I've been doing since then, and writing some papers on especially relevant kind of theoretical topics. I think in terms of the future, I mean, I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a physicist. I see the future of my part of the subject as consisting in us learning slowly but surely what kind of conditions in the brain will permit ordinary persons to access these higher capacities. I think that is bound to happen. The explosive increase in research on meditation will certainly tend in that direction. I mean, it's kind of peculiar right now because I mean that explosion has occurred because meditation research has been able to sort of connect itself to the public health issue, which is
Mhm.
where most grant money comes from.
Yeah.
In the course, Mike Murphy jokes about this, by the way, about research on meditation for hemorrhoids and things like that. But inevitably, as this research proceeds, they will start, they're kind of tiptoeing around in the shallows right now. But as it goes further, they're bound to encounter the deeper parts of the subject, which will bring all this stuff along with it. And in the course of all that, we'll learn more about, you know, And the other thing that's happening right now that I think is gigantically important is the psychedelic renaissance.
Yes, sure.
Assuming it can hold together and not run afoul of these kind of cultural prohibitions that Leary and company really provoked,
Yeah.
it has the potential to break the whole subject wide open because there's no doubt that the kind of stuff that I study is historically and cross-culturally associated with use of psychedelics. We know that they can produce genuine mystical experiences under proper conditions. They are a vehicle for the experimental study of mysticism and mystical experience and its consequences for human life. So that's going to happen for sure.
Well, I agree. When you add all that up, there's a huge cultural swing happening. And
Yeah.
the way I feel about it is there's a lot of things in the world that I find disturbing. And,
Yes.
you don't even have to elaborate. I think everybody feels that way. But at the same time, there are a lot of prohibitions that have been lifted, like the conversation about psychedelics. This
Mm-hmm.
was not happening 10 years ago. And all of a sudden, it's, people having experiences. Now, I've done a little of that myself. I am extremely conservative about it. I think you can get yourself into all kinds of problems, but it's clear enough that when people have experience of their mind opening up and embracing a totally different reality, you can't unring that bell.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of bells that have been ringing that you can't unring. So I'm optimistic about where these things are going. I think, like when you talk about healthcare, I think a lot of people are really, really tired of the way the old machine's been running. It is not serving people.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been great, Ed. So again, the book Irreducible Mind, and can you mention the name of the other two books again? Could you
Yeah.
hold this up?
Yeah. I'll hold them up again. Beyond Physicalism Toward
Yes.
Reconciliation of Science and Spirituality.
Hmm.
It's got a concluding chapter, by the way, by Mike Murphy talking about evolutionary panentheism as a form of realist idealism that's cropped up numerous times in human history, always squelched for one reason or another, but now coming back with science on its side, I think. So it may succeed this time. And just to
Yes.
add to what you said about our current cultural uh, condition, that reference to the Titanic was not an accident. I see us as being really in a what you know from real time program a race condition. It's a question of whether we're going to deflect it or annihilate ourselves. Basically, that's where we are. I don't know how to pull those social levers. I just do my work as a scientist and hope somebody else can, you know,
Yeah.
use our stuff in conjunction with lots of other things to help move that ship in the right direction. And boy, it's going to be hard. I mean, the conservative forces in science are really powerful. And opposition to our kind of stuff certainly is concentrated at the highest levels of the scientific establishment.
Yes, it is.
Even though the founders of quantum theory, I think, would have been on our side.
Oh, yeah. I agree. And then the other book, once again, could you
Oh,
just
sorry, I got
pull that?
distracted.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one, Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. That subtitle was chosen as a thumb in the eye of the opposition.
Well, you're certainly very simpatico with Evolution 2.0. So this has been a great
Yeah.
conversation. Thank you. Is there any particular way people should follow you or reach out to you if they how can people engage further with the work that you're doing?
The easiest way is just to Google DOPS, DOPS, Division of Perceptual Studies, UVA, and you'll go right there. First one or two returns should be us. And there's plenty of stuff on the website, including ways to contact us personally if you wish.
Well, Ed, I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time, and I want to thank you for your time. And I think we're on the edge of a whole new wave of science. So
No, I agree. we're definitely in the same tribe here. Let's hope that we can survive.
We will. Take
And
care.
actually, I feel sure that we're on the winning team, but we may not be around to see it happen.